Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today we're going to go over how you can paint a Leman Russ, or indeed any Imperial vehicle. I've been putting this one off for a little while. Tanks tend to take a bit more work than your basic infantry do, but the techniques are still pretty simple. What we're going to do is start from the basics, and I will link all of the paints and what have you in the description below. So feel free to follow along. There are a few optional steps listed, so when you come across those, just see whether or not you like the look of them. And without any further mucking around, let's get started. Now I've started by giving our Leman Russ a primer of Death Guard green. And you might wonder why this instead of something like Chaos Black. Now if you are going to be painting 3, 4 or more Imperial vehicles, then Death Guard green, a can of that, is not a bad purchase. Reason being, if we're going to put Castellan green as our base coat on for this tank, over black you'll find you will need to do 2, maybe 3 coats in some places. 2 is about normal though. With a lighter green to start with, what we'll find is we can get away with doing just 1 coat in some places. So I'm using the extra large Citadel base brush, and just a tiny bit of water in my mix to make sure that this goes on a little bit more smoothly. All I'm going to do now, this is the hard part, we're painting the whole tank green. Now, I've got the glove on because what I'm going to do is do this whole side and flip the tank, do the other, and then when those two are dry, I can use my hand, I can grip the sides of the tank and be able to paint the center without having to worry about any of it coming off on my fingers or leaving any unsightly fingerprints. So this normally doesn't take too long, a couple of minutes just to finish off all of this tank. We'll come back and see what happens next. Now with that Castellan green done, we've got the base coat for our tank. Now to be completely honest, I did actually come back and give it a second coat. I put the first one on and it looked a little bit streakier than I had wanted it to. So you might find the same when you come to do it over yours. One way or the other, just make sure you've got a nice solid base coat for that green, and don't forget, you have a turret. The number of times I have gotten through painting a tank and then gone, oh yeah, that thing, the shooter. What we're going to do now, though, is get on some of the camo stripes. And for this, we're going to use Rakarth flesh. Now, some of you are going to wonder why we wouldn't use something like Zandri Dust. On the cover of the box itself that the Russes come in, the white or the beige camo stripes are actually quite light. So I reckon if we start from a lighter base coat for that, we're going to find it easier to put the right color over top. So let's get into that. And for this, I'm going to use the large base brush, very similar, and it's got that nice wedged tip. All we're going to do is start just painting on pretty roughly the outline that we want for these camo stripes to follow. So you don't have to be terribly careful with this. All you're doing is just bulking out what shape you want this to be. So I'll put another one back here, and you can do this any old way that you fancy. You might find that you like using the sort of sponge technique, which I've done in other videos for camo. But whatever you're doing, make sure you get your turret on at the same time, because you'll find it easier to sort of match up which direction the camo stripes are going to come from. Now this can take a little bit. These are a bit fussy, so take your time, and we'll come back once I've got a couple of these sort of blocked in. Now once you've got the outline of your camo pattern, you might find there are some areas where you've either got a rough sort of brush edge, or it's not quite as covered as you would like. Just thin down some Rakarth flesh and use your medium shade brush just to block in these areas and smooth out any of those parts where you want a nice crisp edge to that camo pattern. Now it's worth pointing out, you can also do this by getting your, Castellan green, and doing the green to edge in the camo, but that's up to you. Just because I've got it out, I tend to think the fastest way to do it is to stick to the paint that you've got right in front of you. So I'm going to fill these areas in, smooth out my edges, and we'll come back and see what that looks like. See here, for example, let's just... yeah, we'll come back and have a look. There we go, that's easier once this is all done. Now once you've got all of that squared away and it's had plenty of time to dry, grab yourself some Screaming Skull, and we're going to stick to the medium shade brush for this. We're just going to paint over all of those camo stripes. So this is going to be a little time consuming, but nice and simple. So let's just quickly go over all of this. Yeah, not being terribly careful with it. You'll see I'm going to probably end up with some brush strokes in this. If you do need to go back and give it a second coat, of course you can decide, once you finish with that, what you like the look of. Now, about a third of the way through, I actually realized maybe if I go back to my large base brush, the same as I was painting the first layer of camo on with, I can do that much quicker. And it turns out, yes. So what I'm going to do now is the same thing we did to tidy up the first color, and just get my Castellan green and fix up any of the areas I've just made a mess of. Now, once that's all finally finished, we are at last ready to get to the good stuff, and that is our dear friend Agrax Earthshade. I've got the large shade brush. You can use any brush you sort of fancy for this. I do recommend that bigger is probably going to be better. What we're going to do is we're going to apply the shade to essentially one area of the tank at a time. Because if we splatter shade all over this and then we stand it upright to dry, what's going to happen is we might get some of those tide marks. Instead, what we'll do is load up a brush. It doesn't need to be a massive amount on this. And we're just going to paint all of this over all of the side of the vehicle, and then leave it to dry, sitting like that. Turn the tank over, do the other side, and then you can do the center, without having to worry too much about how it's laid out. But for these first couple of panels on the sides of the vehicle, I think you'll find it much easier. Like I said, put this on, let it dry sitting upright, and then do the other side. So, once we've finally got my Agrax Earthshade on, oh, that feels better. We'll let that dry, and then come back once all of these panels are dry. And remember, you do have a turret. Now, I've given that a full hour to dry. In that time, I went and made myself a cup of tea, and we're ready to rock and roll. Now, you will notice it has gone a little bit patchy over the beige areas, because we're going to get a little bit of texture the way that I've applied the Screaming Skull. It's nothing too much to worry about, though, because what we're going to do now is going to help tidy some of that up, and it's a heck of a lot quicker than individually lining everything in. Now, you'll notice I've actually got one of my little makeup brushes here. I cannot recommend these enough for particularly how we're going to dry brush this stuff on. Now, you can pick these up from Amazon. It doesn't particularly matter what brand you're using. I've just got one that looks about the right size. What I'm going to do is grab my Tyrant Skull, and we'll just dab a little bit on the end of the brush there. Work it into the bristles on some kitchen towel. And then just start fairly generously flicking this over the beige areas. You'll notice very quickly we do get a slightly tidier finish to that beige. It's not as perfect as if we had painted it on with a brush, for example, like if we'd gotten out our large shade brush again, so medium shade brush, but nice and quick as a way to sort of bulk out that color again. You can even stipple on Tyrant Skull in some areas and get rid of some of those tide marks. But just go around now, and we're going to do this to all of the beige areas. Just be careful once you get close to the edge of those stripes. Right, now I've got Nurgling Green and another brush, and this time all I want to do is really just catch the edges. This is going to be our fake highlight stage. We're just dry brushing to catch the edges. We don't want to do the same as we did with the Tyrant Skull and really change the color of this green. All we're looking to do is brighten it up a little bit, pick out some of those rivets and the hard edges, and a real quick dry brush with Nurgling Green will do the job for that. Now, there is one final step with this camo, which is purely optional, but I think is going to add quite a bit to the overall look. I've got another brush and some rack white, and I'm going to do the same with the beige camo strips, as we just did with the Nurgling Green. So all I'm looking to do is pick up those extreme edges, and I'm using rack white because it's got a little bit of peachiness to it, which means it won't stand out too sharply against the beige. Add as much of this as you like. I think you can be maybe a little more generous than I have there. But we'll come back and have a look at this once that's finally done and our camo is at last complete. So now that we have finally done the camo, that is most of the tank done. What I'm going to do now is the tracks, and you'll notice I have assembled the tank with the tracks on because you can paint them separated, but I tend to think it creates a whole lot of extra work trying to get them back on once everything is painted. What I've got is my large base brush still. And what I'm going to do, this is a little bit of dryad bark, and just paint starting from one edge towards the center, and then you flip your tank around and do it in the opposite direction. This is a surprisingly quick way to get these base coated without having to worry about messing up the paint you've already done. Now you can, of course, get some Screaming Skull or some Castellan Green if you make any mistakes. I think across a whole tank you're barely going to notice, though. You could also swap out and do straight to, what is it now? Lead Belcher. Do metallic tracks, but I think this is going to look a little bit more realistic. I know, realism in our tiny plastic spaceman tanks, but hear me out, because not only will that be the case, but you're going to save yourself a ton in Agrax Earthshade. So let's just finish these off and come back once they're done. Then once that's dried, I've got one of my little cheap brushes, dollar store styly things, and just a bit of Necron compound, and all I'm going to do is lightly flick back across the tracks there, nice and quick, and there we go. Easy as that. Now with the tracks done, we'll move on to some other areas of metal, and for that I'm going to use Lead Belcher. You could go ahead and use Iron Hand Steel, that's quite a nice one. A little bit brighter than this, which I think works quite nicely. Or you might want to go the opposite direction and use Iron Warrior, which is super dark. I just got my medium base brush here, and all I'm going to do is fill in all these areas of metal. There's a little bit of water in my paint as normal. So don't forget, you've got your exhausts and what have you here, and those areas on the gun barrel, which you're probably going to want to touch up with some of this metal too. If you're lost, you're not quite sure where things should go, just take a look at the stuff on the box. Now before we do anything with the metal, I've actually got some Corax white here. Now I found the easiest way to keep this, in working condition was just to drop a couple of drops of Lamian medium, like a couple of brushfuls, into the pot itself. And then I've got a Space Marine head lurking in there as an agitator, which just helps keep things flowing. So a little bit of water in your paint still while you're using it, and just cover over any of those areas that are going to be white. There's normally only a couple of Aquillas for this, but it does look nice if you do pick them out. Now get yourself some non-oil and your shade brush, and we're just going to go over all of the metal areas and the white areas too. You don't need to be too generous with this, just enough to get into the recesses, add a little bit of shading. And bearing in mind, if you have done your tracks brown like I have, you're not going to need to shade over these. Although you could, to be perfectly honest. But I think it looks fine as it is. And while that shade is drying, if you're careful, grab yourself some Mephiston Red, and you can block in the, what do you call these, windows, viewports, whatever they are. Just your medium layer brush, and quick coat of this will see you right. And then, still with my medium layer brush, what I'm going to do is just paint an L shape of Fire Dragon Bright up across the top corner like that, just to get a real quick sort of reflection effect. Now if you do want to add any transfers, I would put them on at this stage. You want to add transfers before you do any weathering, otherwise they're going to stand out and look a little too clean. What I've got, this is an old brush that I've just folded over a bit of old blister pack foam. You can find this in all sorts of things. And I've just glued it down so that I've got this weird nonsense bit of brush. I'm going to go back to our drybrush bark, get a little bit of that on this, and just kind of dab it around so that I get this nice random splotchy pattern. Then just pick some areas where I want a little bit of wear and tear. So just along, areas where you expect there to be a fair bit of activity. So let's go along the edge of the door here, along there. I would suggest don't go crazy with this, especially if it's not, especially if it is rather your first time doing this, because it's very easy to go overboard. And then you're going to have to go back, and oh my goodness, that is a lot to go back to doing. So take your time. Then get yourself another bit of foam, flip it around in the same way, and with some lead belcher, just dab over roughly the same area where you've put those chips. You want slightly less silver than you have got brown, but that'll help just sell that multi-layered effect to that armoured chipping. Then as a final step, if you fancy, you can just go ahead, grab some gloss varnish and just fill in over the top of those windows. Viewports. I am going to find out what the name for these bleeding things is. And there we have it. At last, our Leman Russ is complete. Now, this will work on any Imperial vehicle, so if you've got Sentinels or Chimeras or what have you that you're looking to do, the same method will make them look just the same, funnily enough. From here, you could go ahead and add typhus corrosion, dry brush on some extra white, or whatever you wanted to do. But for getting these guys looking pretty good, if I do say so myself, I'd be happy enough, put that on the table and add that to my collection. I'm pretty pleased. So as always, guys, any questions or anything, feel free, drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Facebook are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time. Let's put that down. And you guys enjoy the rest of your day.